So today on the show, I have the great pleasure to welcome Klaus Nimzov. Hi, Klaus. How are you doing?
Hi, Philip. I'm good. Good afternoon, probably good morning for you.
Where in the world are you hiding?
I'm hiding in Singapore, in plain sight, so to speak.
So, Klaus, you're the CEO of Binex Singapore, and you've been innovating for what? Is it 35 years?
Well, I guess so, if you can call it innovation, definitely.
So you have participated in some exciting project, and I start with one of them. That's one app that most of us know probably. It's Shazam, right?
Yes, and indeed. I think we went live in 2001. But yeah, that was definitely an early example of true innovation, I think.
So what were you doing, if we can dig into that topic a little bit? Because most of us are users of this app, which actually I really like. So what was the idea? Can you tell us a little bit about the story?
Yes, absolutely. So I was working with Dheeraj Mukherjee, one of the founders of Shazam, Viant, one of those internet consulting companies during the boom and bust of the first internet in London. And at some point, Dheeraj left. It would have been probably 2000 or so. And then a few months later, he invited me and a bunch of other people to sign NDAs to see if we were interested in coming in as angel investors in this new endeavor in their Shazam. So at that point, they showed us sort of a very rudimentary application. And the whole idea was from one of the other founders, the main founder, I suppose, Chris Barton. He had this idea. He liked to go to clubs and listen to music on the radio. And often he didn't know what the song was that was playing. And at that time, it was impossible to find out. I mean, you could call the radio station. And that was really the simple thing that he wanted to do. And he got together with Philip Engelbrecht and other of the co-founders. Those were kind of business people that wanted to make this happen. But there was no solution at the time for that. So then they had to go out and literally find somebody who could create and invent the technical solution to make it possible. And they found Avery Wang, who at the time was a researcher, PhD at Stanford University in their acoustic lab. He decided he could probably do that, and they persuaded him to join as one of the four co-founders. And so I came on board originally through Dheeraj as an angel investor in Shazam. And then in March, April, perhaps 2000 or 2001, basically when the internet started to crumble a little bit, they asked me to join as a COO. So I was kind of first employee after the founders in London. I liked the idea and the challenge, and the technology solution was really revolutionary at the time. There was just no solution that could do that through mobile phones at scale. So the challenge was you need to do this with millions of songs, full-length songs, and you needed to capture maybe a 10-second or less than 10-second audio sample in very noisy environments where you might be able to hear sort of bits and pieces of the music. And then within less than 100 milliseconds, it had to come up with a result with relatively high accuracy and not too many false positives. So that was kind of how I got involved with Shazam.
So you were the first employee after the founders in Shazam. Well, that must have been quite an exciting time.
It was because it was right after 2001 when this whole internet boom came crumbling down. And all the companies closed that had unrealistic valuations and not really solid business models. So Shazam really was created in hard times. There was no easy money. So we had to do fundraising. I helped to raise £5 million, $7.5 million or so after the angel round. And it was really working in a very early startup. We had 2 little rooms in Soho and were going out meeting in coffee shops and trying to raise money. But in some ways, it was relatively easy. It's not the right word to raise money, but it was easy to persuade people that like that idea. It's very compelling because many people have the same need. So that was kind of the easy part, but it was not easy to raise money. And then certainly it was hard to create all the different components. So yeah, it was great fun. And I did that for a couple of years until we started expanding internationally. I was at Shazam for about 4.5 years, I think, until 2005. And then I took on a role as international business development. I traveled around the world and with my team we'll set up deals with many phone companies because at the time it was way before iPhone and App Store and all those types of things. So you had these feature phones and you had to work with each individual phone company. There wasn't even an app. So any additional service other than doing phone calls and sending text messages. So it was interesting because we had to work with different parts of the phone company. One was to allow us a short code. So at the time, we came up with 2580 because of the 4 middle digits. Simon Coley was the creative guy from New Zealand that came up with that idea. And then we had to cut deals with that part of the telephone or mobile phone carrier that was handling the dial-in capabilities. And then another part of the company was dealing the SMS and we had to charge the service. It was very rudimentary, but the core proposition that you could find out what that song is and you would get a text message with the song. And then you could buy a ringtone. I don't know if you remember those times. You could buy the ringtone with that music if you had one.
Just to remember how that was working. Basically, you are in a club, you make the phone, listen to that, and you get the SMS telling you what the song is. That's the way it worked.
That's it, exactly. We were capturing the audio in this 10-second sound sample. It had to go through the entire length of 1.62 million songs almost instantaneously. We couldn't tell you in 10 minutes. You wanted to know it now. And you can do it 1,000 songs, but it's a very different problem to scale that up. So that's where Avery came in with this, fast Fourier transformation-based algorithm that could do that at scale with very noisy environments. That was the other thing. You wouldn't hear, in a club, you had lots of noise, and it had to detect the frequency artifacts that would survive in the sound sample and the distance. So then the other thing we had to get right is the probability back. You decide it is this song with a certain probability, or you decide, I don't know what the song is. You had this threshold to set it because if you would be too demanding, it might not come back and tell you what the song is. It would come up with false positives, and that's the worst. You have to get the balance right. It's very interesting, the technical balancing we had to do against the customer experience and customer satisfaction.
In that case, you actually started from an idea, and then you found the right people for the technology. That was not the opposite. You didn't have the cool tech and said, hey, let's make it a business.
It's very true. And so all credit goes to Chris Barton, then assembling the business team and then getting Avery to invent the solution. And then I joined afterwards. But you're absolutely right. It's a particular problem that didn't have any solutions before. Now, it was a problem that was shared with other people with love for music and curiosity. But yeah, and that's exactly what it was.
When you talk with investors, they always ask you for a business plan. Now, when you look at the business plan you had at that time and what it became actually out of this company, were you even close to what you expected?
That's a good question. I think in some cases, yes. So I think the fundamental proposition, this is something that people like and that they're willing to pay for. Of course, not everybody. That worked well. I think in terms of the uptake, this hockey stick that everybody's expecting, that was probably not quite realistic. And what was also challenging is this is the kind of thing where I think we all believe that word of mouth and the viral effect would make that possible. At the time, you had sort of Yahoo Mail or Hotmail or those types of things. You had sort of examples in the internet world that everybody was familiar with about functioning viral effects. But what we learned is that doesn't happen for all types of ideas without getting some kickstarting. So it turned out that marketing was really important. And the other thing is a company, Shazam, well, there's not much they could have done about this, is the user experience was very clunky. It was difficult to get the same number with all the mobile companies, and you couldn't advertise the service. If you have this carrier, you have to use this number, if this another one. That changed after I had left for a couple of years. I think it was 2007 when the iPhone came along. And not just that, that's only the part of that. It was the App Store that helped Shazam then to really become what it's always wanted to be, which is a seamless user experience and lots of things. Now we will get lyrics and just a very rich user experience. So it was the technical constraints that probably hindered growth initially.
But then it went very fast. You started in 2001, as you said, with these old-fashioned phones, and then in 2007 with the iPhone, you could scale up thanks to the apps. And now it's global. It's everywhere. Everybody knows Shazam, right?
Yes, which is also funny because Shazam, I think, was this comic, right? This Marvel comics. We also had some legal discussions how we can use the name and all that. But there's a big gap, but a number of years between 2001. I left in 2005. And at that point, we had reached a certain level where everybody who knew about it, who was willing to pay for that, at the time, I think we were still mostly paying for each successful recognition. And that's a very different model. So subscription was another thing. But if you have costs associated with every failure, then it's that business model. I think it then took a few years between 2005, when it was still not growing that fast, and then 2007, it took off. And then it was acquired by Apple a few years ago.
Do they have any big competitors nowadays, or have they taken the whole market?
No, I think there is a company called SoundHound. And actually, the lady who was in my business development team, she left, I think it was after I had left also, and joined SoundHound. So certainly SoundHound at the time was doing similar stuff. I don't know about which technology they used. And today, I'm sure I haven't really sort of looked into the technology recently, but I'm sure now there's sort of AI algorithms following your behavior and consuming music, and then probably comes up with recommendations based on that. So perhaps it matters less today exactly what that song is and exactly who the artist is, but I'm not too close to that industry anymore.
If you had to say these were my major challenges as a COO for the company, what were they?
Well, I think the challenge was to create a digital music database for purposes of the recognition. Because if you want to do this mathematical fingerprint that you would get from the audio sample, you have to compare that against a mathematical fingerprint of millions of songs in full length. So in order to create these fingerprints, we had to get digital music and then create these fingerprints. And at that point, the record labels were not recording it, certainly not making it available to us in digital form. So that was kind of a challenge, how to create this big fingerprint database. And then also getting right how many songs do we need to start. There were other challenges. DJs would change the pitch and the speed, and the algorithm initially didn't like it because it's an algorithm that is very precise because of these frequency details. It could distinguish different recordings of the same thing. You and I would not be able to distinguish between different versions. The algorithm could. But the other side of the coin was that if it's a DJ changing things slightly, then for the algorithm, it would look like two different songs. So unless we had this in the database, and then later I think we found some changes, some twitches to the algorithm. But those were all kind of challenges because you had a new technology, you had lots of things to build up with limited funds. So those were probably some of the challenges, the proposition, and if you could demonstrate it to people, everybody loved it.
But were you heading the technology too? Was that under your team too?
No, I was heading the technology, Avery and his team working on the algorithm, but then you had lots of other challenging technologies. And actually I brought in a bunch of people that worked with me at Vine before I brought them to Shazam from Munich and from London. And at the time, the other challenge on that side was that there was no cloud computing. And we needed, vast farms of servers. So Mike Kalina was the technology guru on my team, and I took plastic bags and walked through Tottenham Court Road and bought components for PCs, for servers, the fans, the CPUs, and then really creating these things to make it cost effective. So we were doing our own little cloud computing rack of servers in data centers because you couldn't use it.
That must have been an exciting time, actually.
It was fantastic. It was really good and a great team.
So actually, you and I, we met quite many years ago back in Asia, in Hong Kong. And at that time, we had a common interest. These were what you call now maybe the metaverse, but that time it was more virtual worlds, 3D worlds. And you developed a really cool company. That was a 3D avatar school, if I remember well, yeah?
That's right. That was kind of another fascinating thing. It started, actually, I have a TED talk somewhere about this. It started when I was observing my son, who was 10 years at the time, how he would play games like World of Warcraft. And World of Warcraft was a real-time, immersive 3D kind of environment where you would not be able to see the other players as a video, but you would see them as avatars. And you actually wouldn't have to use voice. And what was fascinating, I remember that there's a raid on another city in World of Warcraft. And my son was punching above his weight. He was this little boy, but he was, whatever character he was playing, he was a very high level. So people were accepting him as part of a team that was really doing complex collaboration, clearly led by much older people, adults. And he could play a role simply because people recognized his merit, which was this level thing that he had in the character. But it was also the enabling very complex collaboration between people from obviously all around the world. So I thought, wow, there's something going on in these games. At the time, parents would be very critical of video games and not allow their kids to play this. And we were much more permissive. And it was really fascinating to see what was going on there. And then I thought, could we try that? That was actually back in 2007 when I did that. Those were sort of the predecessors to 3D Avatar School. And then 2007, 2008, I was with PA Consulting. That was after Shazam. And we were using, at the time, there was this thing called Second Life. There was sort of a public, and that was an interesting environment. And we were using this, could we build collaboration instead of a Zoom call with multiple people? Could you be in a 3D immersive environment? It was obviously before you had Oculus and those goggles, simply just using a screen. And at PA Consulting, we were building conference environments and multi-user collaboration things for onboarding of people, for example. And it worked very well. We had conferences with the Financial Times, Sunday Times, where you could not just have sort of a conference with one speaker talking, but then you could walk around as an avatar through the 3D environment, and you could spot other people, pretty much what you would do if you go to a conference and you go through different vendor booths in sort of a distributed environment. So that worked well conceptually, but the problem was it was very clunky to get on, and the grown-ups at the time were so used to video conferencing, they were not video gamers. And then the fact that, okay, Second Life was also a public environment, which was really suitable. So then I took that in Hong Kong and said, well, who would be users much more acceptable to that? And it would be the kids that play video games. Forget the adults for a few years until they catch on. And so that was sort of then the idea, could we build an education environment? And that's what we did with 3D Avatar School. That would be for 10 to 14-year-olds to learn languages. So we were developing, originally focusing on Chinese in Hong Kong and then on English in mainland China. So we were building a environment on a private version of Second Life. So we were basically building an environment that used these collaboration immersive elements. But in addition, because it's kind of boring if you're in a virtual room and you interact, that's not really exploiting the potential of this medium. So we put gamification, we built game-like experiences, multi-user experience. We had one teacher, say from the Philippines, English teacher, and then we had the kids in China. And it was used the same elements that we had a number of years before to create a very immersive. People had headphones on. Now, technically, the one important component was spatial audio, which is also funny. Now you hear Apple talking about spatial audio. We had spatial audio back in 2007 and then for Avatar School in sort of 2011, 12. And what that means is that if you see an avatar and that person talks, you can hear the voice coming from the direction. If you turn your avatar's head, so the voice comes from the right side. So it was the stereo volume mix, and the volume mix was distant. So if you go closer to an avatar and that person talks behind that avatar, then it would become louder. So you have this cocktail party effect where you can talk to somebody that you're standing virtually close, it's avatars, and if you go further away. So that allows you to create very immersive and very fluid experiences, because you have small groups. You could walk over from one group to the other, then those voices get louder, really like you would do in a real life situation.
And also, just to explain for our viewers, at that time there's another option that was non-spatial audio. That is, you arrive this virtual world, and if someone is on the other side of the island of the virtual world, you all speak basically as if you were all together next to each other.
Yes, and that's very true. And it was technically very challenging to implement that with low latency, because if everything needs to work fast enough so you don't feel like there's a delay. Worked really well, but was technically a challenge still at the time. But yeah, now that's becoming perhaps the metaverse.
Now about the metaverse, we work a lot with insurance companies and banks. And do you think that in the financial services, the metaverse could be a tool for training or other things? How do you see that?
Absolutely. In fact, we did lots of prototypes and various things back sort of in 2007, 2008 with spatial voice to play through those scenarios. Because it has many advantages, you could bring easily people together, you could share much more complex information. But the consumer side, I think, is still going to be a challenge, unless perhaps Apple comes up with super easy to use technology, hopefully in the next year or two or so. But for training, that's very different. Because for training, you have sort of a captive audience. If your insurance agency or your bank, if you want to train those folks, you can definitely use this. And we have used it just in the last few years in shipping. So I worked at a shipping company, and there we use virtual reality using the goggles, the Oculus, for training seafarers to do complex teamwork with big, heavy machinery. And for that, it totally works. It saves all the travel costs. It's really become so realistic that the regulatory bodies in shipping have signed off on that being a valuable and effective training method. So that's kind of more difficult. So I would think for financial services, that should be easier to do. And you can practice probably interaction and so forth much easier. Also, the one effect that's perhaps also useful is the fact that you don't see somebody as a video conference means, you can be more relaxed. How do I look like? And the camera kind of thing. But you also, in some interesting way, you shield behind this avatar, which can be a good thing if you have hierarchical or even sort of racial discrimination issues to deal with, because as an avatar, you look the way that you want to. you still have the voice, although there's voice mod technology that you could change that as well. So that could overcome perhaps situations where some people might feel disadvantaged, or people that tend to be more shy from perhaps as a personality. What we find is that if they're as an avatar, they feel they can be more outgoing and interact more freely. And then that sort of brings out the intelligence and the behavior and the personality, and it shields a little bit the external thing, which can be very useful, I think, to in training situations.
That's interesting what you're saying there, Klaus, because I remember we had also a virtual world that we used back in Hong Kong and in Switzerland too, to train actually different people from big companies like Alstom, for example, big machinery companies. And then we're training also some teenagers back in Switzerland in hotel management schools. And I remember one day there was one of the worst students, quote unquote. He was completely reluctant to study. In that case, I was Mandarin Chinese. He didn't want to study that. In the presence with a great teacher, we had a great teacher there, and he really didn't care about it at all until we came to the session where we were all in the virtual world. As you said, we were playing through the avatars and learning that way. And I couldn't believe my eyes. We had to kick him out of the classroom because he would not stop using it. And that's when I really started to understand the power of the virtual world and probably the future metaverse.
I totally see that. That's exactly what's happening. That's probably one of the reasons that little boys like to play video games, because they want to be something much bigger, but they're sort of caught for a while, trapped in this little boy body until it becomes as big, as powerful as their brain wants them to be. And that's what I think can express it in video games. And of course, it matters for learning situations very much as well. So absolutely, I think it has all those characteristics. As soon as we get the technology a little bit easier to use, because if you put an Oculus on and you're not used to it, it still takes some time, and some people take that easier than others. Now, the good thing is in training environments, you tend to have more junior, younger people perhaps that in this day and age, 2023, probably aren't used to much more technology like that. It is sort of a generational challenge, I think, as well.
How would you prepare a training program in a virtual world? What's different from the physical world?
What's different is perhaps the technical thing. Graphics obviously look a little bit different, but I think you get used to it, and then it becomes for your brain realistic enough. The one thing that's still a little bit of a challenge is the haptic, the tactile thing. So if you work with machinery and it's heavy to do, I mean, it's pretty good what the Oculus, these vibrational things, fools your brain into thinking this thing is difficult to open. But of course, it doesn't. There is technology out there that will simulate it, but that's still very expensive. So that's still somewhat of a challenge. I think a lot of the other elements, the visual, the audio, navigation through these spaces, can be pretty realistic.
You just spoke about the haptics, and that's really important if you manipulate big objects. But what about in industries where it's much more conceptual, much more virtual? Back to the financial services. Why would financial services need a virtual world? They don't need to operate big, dangerous machinery.
Well, you're right. I think it's maybe less compelling as you have in heavy metal industrial environments. But the 3D immersive environments has some really interesting, powerful ways. So let's say you just have a Zoom call. You have one or maybe two slides at the time. So it's literally two-dimensional, very restrictive. It's not how we work in the real work. So if we would be in an office, we have a conference room where we can put lots of papers on, we could have printouts, we could have multiple screens, we could write things on whiteboards, and we'd be sort of surrounded by all of these things, which is much more powerful than any kind of Zoom call. Now, this is just one conference room. Imagine you could have an unlimited space where you could, even if it's simple abstract information like charts and so forth, you don't have any 3D environment. But in the Oculus world, there are some examples where you have this gigantic environment and you could put, pieces of information into the space. But now you can walk through it. Actually, even back in 2007, instead of showing a PowerPoint one slide at a time, we put it on these pics in this virtual garden. Then we could walk from one to the other, but we could still see the other one in our point of view, and we could go back to this. We had another chart that said this one, like you would interact with physical environments. And I think that can be very powerful for complex financial information. In fact, we were thinking if arbitrage for traders, where you look at 6 screens, well, there's a reason why they want to have 6 screens. If they could have it 3-dimensionally oriented and maybe dynamically configuring itself in a way that is important, you could process information in a much more intuitive way, if we had this landscape of information with just zooming in there. So that's kind of how our brains, I think, have evolved, and I think that would be really powerful to do.
And also for memorization, I think, the famous memory palace.
Absolutely. If we think about what the medium allows us to do, that is different from doing a Zoom call or having a PowerPoint presentation, because you can only count a PowerPoint project at the time. So that's kind of where creativity comes in. And if you had a training environment virtually, you have people from around the world, and the senior person could walk around like a teacher might, and people could see him and say, hey, can you come over here? So yeah, you could start playing with these different capabilities that the medium gives you, and then think about how could you productively deploy that to solve problems that are inherent in our current limitations. Kind of funny because we have limitations in the real world when we get together in offsite meetings or in training sessions. And then we all went back to the COVID thing. And that's even more terrible now. All you have is flat video things.
It drove us crazy, but do you think COVID has helped on the digitization of training, of bringing video conferencing to the masses?
Oh, absolutely. Because the example that I had earlier with Eastern Pacific, we developed a virtual reality training program with a company in Denmark actually called Canva. It was commissioned before we started, before COVID came, literally 3 months before that. And then it became not just a nice to have and innovation example, it became a must, because we couldn't bring all the seafarers from Eastern Europe into the Korean shipyard easily because you had all these amazing quarantine restrictions. So it really helped us a lot to do that. And it was also an example that if you bring people physically together, let's say in these machine simulator things with real bits and of kit, then you have to cram everything into a week or into a few days because they're there. If you don't have that limitation, then you don't have to do everything in an intense week. You can spread it out. You can do repeating things. And one thing that the instructors told us in this virtual training is, when you start the training, you learn it, then you go away from the training, you forget. So another example, with this virtual reality technology, you could deliver training in a different way. So during COVID times, for the question, that definitely matters. And it sort of brought home the value. So totally true.
Yeah, and spaced repetition that you speaking about, that's exactly the key to really learn something. And not just to learn something, as you said, and then everything disappears and you forget it a few weeks later. So great. You've done a lot of innovation, different things online, the Shazam experience. So what are you doing these days?
So the shipping innovation I did until last year. And then in July, I joined Finex. And what I've discovered during the days in shipping is that people were using technology innovation to reduce fuel consumption, which is a big part of all these big container vessels and oil tankers and so on. So you're trying to come up with like sophisticated technology to maybe shave off 5% of consumption, which saves money, but it also reduces the emissions. So shipping industry, like everybody else, but perhaps a little later than others, woke up to the fact that they need to do their contribution to prevent global warming. But over just the last year or two, people in shipping started to think about maybe we can replace our entire fuel with green fuels. So biofuels, basically. So that's becoming a big challenge. Coal power plants have the same concern, burning coal, and they're not supposed to. They have to stop that at some point. Could they use something else? So right now, what I found is this company that takes a plant called sorghum, which you might not know. It's like a rice grass. It's used for food for human. And they bred this in a way, and there's not much digital at that point about that it grows very big and very fast and produces these masses of stems and leaves and green stuff. It still produces food as well, of course. And then we take that and we produce through a variety of technologies, either biomethanol, which is what's probably going to be the future biofuel in shipping instead of hydrocarbon-based. And we produce little utility pellets also that we can then use to replace coal and coal power plants. So basically, I'm in a startup, if you will, because it's still early stage, that is using not so much any of the digital technologies I did before, but farming, basically. So I'm a farmer now.
It's one of the most beautiful jobs in the world, being farmer, back to the roots.
Absolutely. And it's interesting because when people think about how they can create green energy, most people think about solar and wind. And to create fuels, there's big stuff underway to take wind turbines and solar panels in Western Australia and plaster the land of square kilometers, and then to produce hydrogen and ammonia and other things that could be used as green fuels. Our approach is different. We're saying you could just plant a nice green plant and use that sort of Mother Nature's way of sequestering carbon, CO2, and produce green fuel that way. And of course, personally, I prefer that, but it's also something that in some countries like the indigenous population, Australia, would much prefer, I think, this green organic approach as opposed to wind turbine and solar panels with the same goal to produce green fuels. So yeah, so I'm excited about that. And of course, in the digital, if you want to do that at scale, of course, we'll be able to use the latest in low-flying satellite technology and IoT and sensors and AI. So that will these things will help us to do that very economically, minimizing the utilization of fertilizers. And so agri-tech is something that I'm trying to bring together now with biofuels.
Just for me to get a big picture, because I don't know much about biofuels or nothing actually. By the time you put the seed until it's reached the right size, how much time does it take?
It only takes about 4 months or so, 4 to 5 months, because the stuff grows just very fast. You have these 5, 6, 7, 8 meters high jungle of biomass after 4 or 5 months or so. And then you produce pellets and biofuel, but that just doesn't take much time then. So it's actually relatively fast. I mean, you need to do this in lots of land. So starting the trials in Australia is great because there's so much land that can be used that still has enough water available.
Do you need a lot of water for it?
Not too much, because the seed has been created to grow on marginal land. So one thing that's important with biofuels that you don't compete with food. So the traditional criticism, if you use normal food, and people go hungry, particularly now with what's going on in Ukraine. But also, the seed has been created to grow on marginal land. So that's land that would not be used for food production. It still produces food. That's the important thing. And it doesn't need too much water.
What's the whole timeline? From the time you say, now I want more fuel, how much can you produce? How much time does it take?
Well, lucky for us, the shipping industry cannot and doesn't want to change overnight, because to build what you need for the methanol side, for example, the whole ecosystem needs to come together. You need to have shipping lines that says we want to have biofuel in these quantities over these many years. And then they need to build ships that actually are able to use this new biofuel. And they need engines from engine manufacturers like MAN in Denmark. They need to produce engines, and these things are big, they're like 100,000 horsepower, gigantic engines that can take methanol. Over the years, we need to produce significant quantities, but it can start relatively small, and then over the next up to 2030, there will be significant quantities needed. So that's kind of the development in the shipping industry. And nobody is under pressure to replace everything overnight. But what everybody is under pressure to start now and then to demonstrate year by year increasing replacement, blending, reduction in CO2 emissions.
That sounds like a very interesting new project as always, Klaus.
It is great fun.
Yep. So I wish you all the best with this new project. And thanks a lot for this interview. It was a pleasure. It was very interesting.
Yeah. My pleasure. It was interesting to bring out these old memories and talk about this. So thanks very much for having me.
Have a good time in Singapore. Cheers.